Welcome, listener. This is Sebastian Nothwell, joined by John Starling, author of What Manner of Man and the Sacred Sins of Father Black, here today to discuss serial fiction. Hello, Sinjin.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, one of the two biggest examples of serial fiction I've got just right off the bat is Penny Dreadfuls of the Victorian era, because I'm a very predictable man. And these were novels written and sold chapter by chapter weekly through the 19th century, such as Varney the Vampire, begun in 1845, which ran for 232 chapters, some of which make it painfully obvious that the author was out of ideas in any particular given week. And then came Carmilla, not serialized, and also Dracula, published as a complete novel in 1897, also never a penny dreadful. However, it became serialized fiction through Dracula Daily, a Substack newsletter created by Matt Kirkland in 2021. And because Dracula is written in epistolary format with the story told through letters, newspaper articles, and diary entries, each of these has a date attached, and Dracula Daily reorders the story to release it chronologically on the date corresponding to each of these epistolary pieces, which means it runs from May 3rd to November 7th every year. And while in the original novel everything is arranged into chapters by subject, for example, the chapter detailing the voyage of the Demeter is just the ship's full log, reproduced as a newspaper article, the Dracula Daily version creates some interesting juxtapositions by arranging things by date instead, such as Jonathan Harker's harrowing journal entries while he's trapped in Dracula's castle, contrasted against Lucy Westenra's cheerful letters to her dear friend Mina regarding her courtship with her 3 boyfriends. And Dracula, going from novel to serial via Dracula Daily, brings us to What Manner of Man. So Sinjin, what manner of book is What Manner of Man?
Well, that's the novel that I wrote in response to Dracula Daily. It is a queer Gothic romance about a priest and a vampire. I originally serialized it throughout 2023, and as of Halloween of 2024, which is no longer this year, it has been published as a edited and expanded, complete and final novel. So, yeah, when Dracula Daily went viral on Tumblr during its second run, it was originally run in 2021, and I think it gained a respectable but small readership of about 1,600 people, something like that. And it was in its second year that it went completely viral, primarily on Tumblr. And I had already written one book at that point. I had written my first novel, The Sacred Sins of Father Black. And I watched this happen, and I was kind of blown away by it. Because personally, Gothic classics are my bread and butter. They're like my home base, basically. And watching this thing happen where something like 250,000 people followed along with Dracula Daily, it was so much more attractive than the publishing plan I'd originally kind of had for myself with the way I'd sort of intended to publish my first novel, that I was like, oh my god, I have to do something. And so what I ended up doing was that, kind of in the immediate wake of Dracula Daily, a lot of people started creating similar newsletters to it. Other newsletters, also publishing public domain, mostly classics. One of the more popular ones was Whale Weekly, which was going through Moby Dick. And I thought to myself, my god, if I also announce an original novel, I'm gonna be able to sort of connect with people through this. So I made the slightly crazy decision to announce a book I hadn't written yet.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Yeah, no, I was a little bit, it was a little bit of hubris there. I was really confident in myself at that stage. I was like, I got this. And that did put me through probably the greatest strain of any creative project I've ever undertaken. It was really, really hard, because what I did was I came up with a concept for a book that I could write, and I wrote a little blurb, and I announced it, and this was on Tumblr as well. That post immediately got a whole ton of attention, because in that moment that was just what was happening. There was a lot of attention for any project you announced at that point.
I think it was also a lot of people reading along with Dracula Daily and picking up on the deeply homoerotic undertones.
Oh, yeah.
Them being kind of left wanting. So when you announced, hey, I've got a serial Gothic novel, and this time we're going full gay.
Exactly, yeah.
I can imagine.
Yeah, no, completely. there was a lot of people who were clearly, just really glad to have someone, something that dealt with that aspect of the novel. And yeah, it got picked up. It got on, there were a bunch of really big sort of compilation posts that went around of, here are all the people who are doing different projects. And so what I ended up with was, I had something if I remember correctly, 2,000 subscribers to my newsletter before I'd written a word of this book, which was completely terrifying. Yeah, I know, it was maybe, the thing is, it ended up being really hard, but it was worth it. It was absolutely worth it.
hey, congratulations for not completely collapsing under the pressure, because, like, I'm not involved in the project and talking about it after it happened, and I'm nervous.
I had intended it to be a really simple novel. I was like, I'm going to keep this short. It's going to be 20,000 words long. I'm going to do a vampire story as simply and straightforwardly as possible. And that ended up not happening.
I was gonna say, from my own experience with the novel, I don't think that's what happened.
No, I was a little bit crazy at the time. I was just really excited about the idea of it, and I don't know. If anything, in many of my problems in life come from being slightly too confident. But the main problem I had was that I had decided to write this novel from the perspective of a Catholic priest, and that, I think if it had been from any other perspective, I would have had an easier time writing it, because this may come as a shock, but I am not an expert on Catholicism. Most of the details in the novel come from research and trying to figure out how to make a Catholic priest character fit all the various needs that I had from him, in terms of being likable and doing the kind of acting out the plot that I had in mind, was really hard.
Being a little Gothic protagonist trapped in a decaying castle with a handsome man.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. So I ended up having to write 3 drafts of it. But yeah, no, it was all totally worth it, because, I did finish the novel in advance of publication. I managed to get the damn thing finished. But come January, it was launching. I had announced this would launch January 2023. I realized just how much editing the book was going to need. Basically, throughout the whole year, I have an editor who I work with closely. We were both working really hard at sort of editing the novel, and I ended up having to rewrite sections of it, and it was like a game of the deadline was constantly chasing me. Towards the end, some of it, I ended up having to rewrite large sections of the ending, so parts of that were written live, and it was really, really hard, but it was also, an incredible experience, because, I would put out chapters, and I had an audience that, that day I could check, and there would be people responding to them, people making memes and replying to it, and I got an incredible level of engagement with this story, and it really despite how hard it was, I think I'm emphasizing too much just how the difficulties. It was also really, really rewarding, and in the end I'm really proud of the way the story came out. I don't know if I would ever do the same thing again, but it did all work out in the end, and that's the most important thing.
A little Souls-like and a little skydiving.
Yeah, no, exactly. I am planning on doing more. I really, really like the format. If I had, managed to finish the project in advance, or otherwise not announced a concrete release date on an unfinished project, I think it's purely my own hubris of having given myself a deadline on a product, on a book that that was not ready. We made it work. It absolutely, the book, I think, turned out really, I serialized it all throughout 2023, got to the end, and I looked back over it and realized it needed more. In some ways, it's a little bit to my advantage. I'm an author who tends to underwrite rather than overwrite. I tend to sort of end up writing just all of the essentials of the things that make the book work, and the fun stuff, the bits where the characters kind of have tangential conversations and nice moments together, that kind of thing. I tend to look over the book and realize that it needs more of that. So I decided at that point to expand the book, mostly to elaborate on the central relationship between Father Adelian and Lord Vane, the vampire and the priest, to really flesh out their romance. And so throughout 2024, what I did was I re-serialized the book, the original draft, for a second time. At the same time, I released on Patreon the edited version of the book that I was working on, which ended up being substantially longer.
I was gonna say, it feels kind of like an expanded edition Lord of the Rings DVD in a lot of ways. This is the director's cut. The true final vision.
I consider the published version of the book to be the finished version of the story, and the serialized version to be more of quite a polished draft. Because it was edited. It was edited and had a copy edit done and everything. But it is like, it's not the full story. The full story is the published book. Yeah, so 2024, I re-serialized that original draft of the novel while publishing the edited chapters to my Patreon. And they ended up being somewhere between 15 and 20,000 words longer, that edition of the novel. I think it's a little over 16,000. Mostly more romantic scenes.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I know. This is the thing. It's like sort of too, like, I am in some ways a little bit lucky that that's just how I write. Like, the good stuff tends to come last for me. So the final edition of the book, the published version, has like the stuff people most wanted as well. And it was in that 2024 run that I don't quite know what happened. It really took the book to another level. I think some of it might be people already being familiar with the story. I'm not sure. A lot of what the engagement I got in the first run was like, oh, what's going to happen kind of thing. And in the second run, what started happening, it was a lot more kind of fandom engagement. So I got a lot more people started making fan art, which I was totally blown away by. Quite a lot of fan art. It's amazing. And, sort of more like memes and, sort of elaborate joke posts and tiny fan fictions. Not like, as far as I'm aware, like there isn't an AO3 category for it or anything, but...
It does kind of remind me of the renaissance that Dracula Daily itself had, where, like, the first year was like, okay, everyone get used to this existing, and then year 2, everyone's like, guys, you gotta get into this.
It's a little bit.
My best friend Victor's having a wild time.
Although, I mean, to nowhere near the same level, I very much do not have a 250,000 people following me.
No.
But yeah, no, it's like somehow I was a little bit nervous rerunning it. I was really worried that people would find it kind of annoying to get the same book a second time. But it was Dracula Daily. It was like, I was looking at Dracula Daily and it's like, oh, well, that's become an annual thing. Like, people are still following Dracula Daily every year. There's like a dedicated group of people. I think it's like it's no longer like ubiquitous in the way it was, but it has developed like a dedicated, like a core group of people who all every year ritually follow Dracula Daily. And I was like, well, I guess, if Dracula Daily can do it, then I people probably won't be too bothered by it. So, and no, people ended up like really responding to it. I was worried that half of them would drop,
Yeah. But yeah. Told a quality story and people stuck around. I think that's also like part of the modern digital culture of like constantly pushing the new thing has made us kind of forget how much people like to experience the same stories over and over again, if that makes sense.
No, that's totally true. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. There's something about the weekly format. It changes people's relationship with the story than being able to blast through it all at once.
Yeah, like the difference between watching Buffy week to week as it's coming out for 7 years versus sitting down in front of Netflix and binging all 7 seasons in like one hell of a week.
Yeah, no, like exactly. I think it becomes kind of like a little bit of a ritual for people,
Yeah.
It comes out on Fridays and comes out Friday mornings and I know for me, like a few things that I follow week on week, mostly other newsletters. And it'll be sort of like it's part of my day. It becomes part of my schedule that thing is happening. And it's kind of like a bit comforting, in a way.
Yeah. So, since you've published 2 novels, The Sacred Sins of Father Black and then What Manner of Man, in your experience, how does writing and publishing serially differ from non-serial writing?
Oh, there's basically no comparison. The serial has
night and day they are.
Oh my god, yeah. I don't think I could ever go back. The serial has been so much more rewarding in terms of like, what I think sort of most writers want when they're writing is to hear from people about how the story affects them and their reactions and those sorts of things. And I get that, like, people do that every week, for my book. And then on top of that, they're like, they're doing things like they're making fan art. It's like, I feel so grateful for just how much people have responded to this story. I really didn't expect it to be quite as, like, the kind of love that people have given it. Yeah, it's like the idea at this point of spending months and months writing a book on my own, polishing it, editing it, and then like, you build up to the release day, release it, and then you have to just sit there and wait. I don't think I could go back, I'm addicted to the immediate feedback and the like interactivity, I'm constantly in touch with my fans. they're always responding to me and I'm responding to them, and it's really like there's such a community atmosphere around the whole book. I don't think I could ever do anything else at this point.
I mean, it does sound intoxicating, I gotta say.
Yeah, I've always kind of thought that, I've always in the back of my mind had serial fiction as one of the things that I wanted to do. I've always kind of in the back of my mind thought that serial fiction is like in some ways more suited to the digital environment that we all like live in now than just publishing individual like volumes of books, because it's one of the main ways that people interact with fiction online. It already is serial fiction. It's just like people tend not to call it that because it's fan fiction.
That was my second example.
Oh, was
yes.
it? Yeah. I think it's fair to say that fan fiction is one of the most popular genres of fiction in the world right now, you know, and in some ways when Dracula Daily, you know, suddenly exploded onto the scene, it was like, oh, okay, this is it, you know, like it really fit into the kind of vague visions I had of publishing up until then, because I'm aware there's a few serials that have had, you know, quite a bit of success online, like The Martian, you know, but they're all sort of slightly outside of the scope of, you know, my environment. And so I hadn't really had any direct examples that I lived through of like written fiction released in a serial format that had managed to gain any level of an audience, any level of like, you know, any amount of reception. There's other forms of serial fiction that I like, you do see around online, like fiction podcasts and stuff. But I think that the phenomenon with Dracula Daily being a novel that was released serially and had that kind of response is almost unique. It's felt up until now like all of the kind of serial successes have been sort of one-offs, often like different corners of the internet. And it was really validating, I guess, to see something like that happen.
Yeah. For as far as like prose examples go, like my go-to example for digital serial fiction is webcomics.
Yeah, no, that's another one completely. It's still not exactly like a prose novel, and it's always felt to me like there's room for that.
Kind of like a niche waiting to be filled.
Exactly. Almost all art forms that are popular online have some manner of regular releases. I mean, obviously, books are popular online. I don't want to make it sound like they're not. Obviously, there's quite a large readership for like more. I don't even know a good phrase for it. Typically published books, you know, books that are not serials, single volumes of books. There's a large readership of books online. But in terms of like a lot of like native digital or like natively online types of art, they tend to have a kind of a regular serial release schedule, like podcasts or YouTubers, webcomics, that kind of thing. And I really saw no reason why like there's this odd gap where for some reason books aren't in there.
It feels kind of like prose fell into the weird gap between the death of print periodicals and the accessibility of online fiction.
Yeah.
Like we lost a lot of the like literary magazines, the
Totally.
fantasy magazines, the sci-fi magazines before we gained the infrastructure online to replace them.
Yeah. It's interesting because a lot one of the biggest probably the biggest technically self-publishing successes, you know, since the early 2010s was originally a serial. It was 50 Shades of Grey. It's in some ways a terrible example because there's a lot of mess to do with the publication. But
oh god, 50 Shades, yeah. Originally Twilight fanfiction, Master of the Universe, which was then what they call in the fanfiction community pull to publish, where it was taken down, serial numbers filed off to make it original fiction, and then allegedly the author told the Twilight fan community to pre-order the book on Amazon because a win for this fan fiction would be a win for the community as a whole. And then once those pre-order numbers rocketed 50 Shades to the top of the Amazon charts, she cut ties with absolutely everyone in that community. Allegedly is what I've heard.
That it's something like that is the story that I've heard around, and I don't. It's maybe not a great example in some ways, but it's also, you know, in some ways also goes to show that it is like there's something there, you know.
Yeah.
the serial release schedule, releasing a book serially gets a different kind of engagement from people. It gets them invested in a different way. And like, I've certainly felt that. Like, yeah, it's a community atmosphere where like it feels like we're all kind of going through it together a little bit. Like, I'm not exactly, in the community, like, but I'm not quite sure how to describe the relationship, because I do interact with them like kind of constantly, it's very friendly. They all really like it when I interact with them.
I think also because a novel has typically one creator, there's one narrative voice, and that makes it, like, even in the age of, like, directors and actors being on Twitter or what have you, being able to interact directly with the person who's written the novel you love is, like, just a more, like, straight into your veins way to experience the fiction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I don't know if things like this happened in exactly this way before the internet. Like, I know that there was communities of sci-fi writers that had, like, some kind of fandom type relationship in the sci-fi fandom pre-internet, but it's not something I'm at all an expert on. So in any case, it feels a lot to me like it's in some ways more suited to just the environment that people are in online. All of the kind of projects that I see that blow up, not that I've blown up, but all of the projects that I see online that like achieve like, that are quite widespread are ones that have some sort of serial release, like the Magnus Archives or Homestuck. Things like that. They're all serials.
Yeah.
And none of that is to like say that there's anything wrong with the normal way of publishing books, of course.
No, actually, this podcast episode is... Our thesis and mission statement is to destroy all other forms of publication.
That is my goal.
And replace it with serialization.
Yeah. No, only serials may survive. In all seriousness, like, I do think more people should be trying it. I think one of the big barriers people have is the idea of putting things out there for free. I know there's a lot of authors who experiment with publishing chapters on their Patreon, including you, Sebastian. I know you're doing something interesting with your books on Patreon.
I'm doing something. God knows what it is, but it's happening over there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I do know that, like, there's a number of authors who release, like, various draft versions or early previews of their books on Patreon. But I think in general people are quite nervous about trying to do something that's completely free, like what Manor of Man was. And I think people should be more willing to try it, because that is the format for almost all other forms of digital media. Webcomics, YouTubers, podcasts, everything like that. They're all sort of, they've got something they put out for free. And the thing is, if you're putting out something that's good, that people really like, and you seem like a nice person, they're going to want to support you. They're going to want to help you to be able to make more of that. I've had no, like, really any qualms about having put the book up for free in the form that I did, because I don't think I would have anywhere near the, like, thing that's grown around it that I would if I had put it behind some kind of paywall or had published it traditionally or whatever.
It is a lot easier to get people to take a chance on something they've never heard of if it costs them literally nothing.
Yeah, no, like, that's definitely part of it, is if you're a total unknown, I was a total unknown. Like, I did not have anything published. I had no connections or anything. But if you're trying to start out, as a writer, it's a lot easier, to get people to, like, be willing to try to go out on a limb and try something that they've, that's free. And I think it builds up a lot of goodwill with people as well, the willingness to give them things. I see it as, like, partially kind of a reciprocal relationship with the people, with your readers, in terms of, like, you give them something and they give you things back, and I think that's part of what's built up the kind of, like, overall good feeling I get from the people around me. I mean, in some ways I'm lucky. I am aware once you grow past a certain point and you start to get a large enough community around you, it's sort of inevitable that, you're exposed to the kind of things that happen on the internet. But so far, I do think that, like, the kind of generally sense of, I give you these things and you give me the back and and forth is part of why the vibes are really good.
There's a nice kind of reciprocity going on.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you wish more people knew about serial fiction?
Well, one of the big ones is I think people tend to think of serial fiction and novels as wholly distinct. And the distinction is in some ways a little bit fake. Obviously, you get cases like Varney the Vampire, like you mentioned, where the author is essentially improvising, where they're just sort of making it up as they go, and it's super noticeable, and there's no attempt at treating it as a whole, like a single construct, work of art, whatever.
The continuity is vague at best.
Yeah, where it's just whatever they can think of, because they have a deadline.
By which I mean the personal history, feelings, and motivation of the protagonist vary from week to week.
That's incredible.
Which is a wild experience, but I think not what most people expect from a novel.
Yeah, no. I know fanfiction often is also published in that way, though not always, obviously. Like, there's two schools of thought about it. There's the improvisational school, which also, theoretically, you have the benefit of reacting to reactions. It's more in conversation, but it does not produce what I would call, like, good and readable book, necessarily. But it also, it doesn't have to be. I think everybody, people assume that's the only way serials are published, whereas it is completely also possible to write a book in the same way you would write any book. And just instead of publishing all at once, you just publish each chapter once a week, where the end product is still very much like the kind of thing you would recognize as a typically structured novel,
Yeah.
People absolutely release fanfiction like that as well, where they've written the whole thing in advance. And I would advise, by the way, that if you are, if you have any interest, if you aren't planning on doing it in a super interactive way, where you're writing sort of partially in response to what's happened from your fan reaction the previous week or whatever, give yourself as much advance time before the deadline as you possibly can. The closer you get, the more you're working up until the night of the deadline, the more of a nightmare it is.
Truly.
Yeah. If you can finish the whole book in advance, all the better. Although, even you can. It's pretty easy to calculate how far in advance you have, because you're just okay, well, I've written and edited up to chapter 15, and I'm releasing a chapter a week, and it's February, so I know that I've got 15 weeks before I start to get in trouble. A lot of people also think that with serials that you have to end every chapter on a cliffhanger of some sort. That in order to keep people coming back. That has not been my experience. To some extent, I tend to write my novels in such a way that I like to end every scene on a hook, some kind of hook to keep the person interested in what's going to happen next. And just as long as you have sort of a basic philosophy of presenting people with questions of what does this mean? What's going to happen? That'll keep them interested in how the story's going to go. Then they'll keep reading if it's a serial as well. It's just, as long as you're sort of same principles of good storytelling as writing anything, basically.
Yeah. The other Victorian example I have would be Charles Dickens, who serialized all of his novels in magazines before he collected them into complete books. The only exceptions are his novellas and his stage plays. Everything else went into one of his magazines. And like you said, they tend to be more coherent than Penny Dreadfuls because the story was completed, or at the very least outlined, before he began selling it. Whereas Penny Dreadfuls had that much tighter chapter-by-chapter construction and turnaround.
Totally, yeah.
But, if no one told you Dickens' novels were originally serial fiction, you'd probably never know the difference between them and any of their non-serially published contemporaries.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think there was a lot more things like that in the past than there are now because of, what you said about literary magazines, things like that. I think there used to be more of a thriving literary scene of things that were serialized that have sort of mostly been forgotten because people tend not to read old issues of magazines.
They're missing out. There's some wild stuff in there.
No, absolutely.
So what advice do you have for writers who want to take the plunge and start creating serial fiction of their own?
Oh boy, I could probably talk about this for hours. I've thought so hard about different things you could do. So there's a lot of different places you could serialize fiction online. There's a lot of platforms for it. Wattpad is the most popular one. There's also Royal Road is another popular one, which I believe tends to specialize more in anime-inspired genres, portal fiction, and power progression fantasy and stuff like that. if your goal is not really to make any money off of it, and whatever you're writing has any kind of fandom connection, there's obviously AO3, which does accept some kinds of original fiction, and there's a few more. But I personally serialize my fiction through a newsletter, and I'm a big evangelist of newsletters in general as a good thing for people to try out. Because basically the thing about all of those other platforms is that if you do build an audience there, your audience belongs to that platform, and as a result, your career belongs to that platform. You kind of become like an uncontracted worker a little bit. Like, I don't want to like overstate it, but
I mean, it is the truth, though.
yeah, no. Anywhere else you're building, like a following, that following belongs to that platform. And as far as I'm aware, the only place that exists in the current internet infrastructure where your audience really belongs to you is in newsletters. Because my subscribers are a spreadsheet. I can download that spreadsheet and I can take that spreadsheet anywhere. I could set up my own newsletter, host it on my own website if I ever had the technical desire to. I don't know. Or if for some reason I want to leave Substack, which is also not impossible because of all of the various problems with Substack. So I think there's a little bit of legwork involved in attracting people to a newsletter, because you're going to be working in a way where you're like, you have no in most of the time, where you've got sort of a subscriber box where you have to find ways of getting people to take interest and take the plunge on your story. But I think it's really worth it. There isn't really a silver bullet to trying to find ways to attract people to your writing. Like, even if you do pick one of those platforms, if you want to get people willing to take the plunge on your story, you still sort of need to find ways of appealing to the kind of people who are on those platforms. Like if you're on, like I said with Royal Road, like I think the readership there, if I put What Manner of Man on Royal Road, I don't think anyone would read it. At least from my impression of what that platform's like. So
I would be very curious what the Wattpad reaction would be to What Manner of Man. I do wonder.
No, completely. Exactly.
There are moments where I am tempted to experiment and sub out names from One Direction.
Oh, exactly. But yeah, they're basically, no matter what you're doing, you're going to have the problem of finding ways to get people interested in what you're doing. And I think if you're trying to go independent with it, I think is always the right choice. Because long term, you're safer, long term, as various platforms decay or shut down or start censoring things, if you've got that list of people's emails, you can always contact them, You're not going to lose touch with people.
They're not going to wonder why you suddenly vanished from such and such a site and with no way to get in touch with you ever again.
In actual fact, that did happen to me. Less than a month before What Manner of Man started, in 2023, I got spam filtered on Tumblr and my account got banned. They implemented some kind of spam filter that caught tons and tons of people.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, no, it was terrifying. I sent out a panic newsletter oh god. Yeah, I'm not completely independent. I am to some degree, Tumblr is my other hub. I am to some degree, still dependent on Tumblr, the website, for staying in touch with people. I don't want to, again, I don't want to overstate that. And it ended up, it was not, all I had to do was find a way of getting in touch with staff, and they immediately just restored my account, because I hadn't done anything. It was just, I think it's happening to a lot of people now. They've implemented some kind of spam filter because of their bot problem, where, a lot of accounts will just, especially newer accounts, ones that aren't 10 years old, will just get banned randomly. It's great. This is one of this is the problem.
This is a functional website.
Yeah. So, case in point, that can't happen to my newsletter.
No.
I had that happen, and I was able to send out an email being oh god, I've lost touch with everybody because Tumblr has randomly banned me for no reason. Whereas if I was genuinely just completely dependent on Tumblr, then I don't know what I would have done. It's just I would have just panicked for a week, trying desperately to get in touch with Tumblr,
On the point of Tumblr specifically, I think a lot of people look at the vibes.
Yeah.
Are a little strange, and the numbers all seem much lower, but I think if you look at it less as numbers of people engaged total and more as numbers of people who are actually for real engaged with the content.
Yeah.
Because Tumblr doesn't have an algorithm. It's not just shooting stuff at people
No.
for the most part. It's really just like you follow someone, you see it on your dashboard, it shows chronologically, which is something almost no other form of social media is doing right now, which does make it weirdly easier to be seen. It's easier for people who actually follow you there to see what you're posting.
Yeah, it's tricky because on Tumblr, like, if you just make a new account and start posting, like, into the void, like, nothing's gonna happen. This is the downside of the algorithm, is that, like, you do need to interact with people on there.
But also, by that way, you're building more authentic relationships that lead to the kind of fan response that What Manner of Man has received.
No, that's the thing, is, like, I think it's quality of followers rather than quantity in a lot of ways.
Exactly, yeah.
In terms of raw numbers, I have no way of telling how impressive the thing I'm doing seems. I have about some 5,500-ish subscribers to the newsletter. I think that's something,
Yeah, it's not nothing.
No.
I'll tell you that much for free.
But in terms of, like, the overall kind of creator economy out there in the world, I'm aware that is, like, if you compare it to, like, the average kind of YouTuber or something, that's not. It's like nothing, but...
Well, the average YouTuber has one person who watches out of pity.
Okay, that is a good point.
The YouTubers that actually make it onto everyone's For You page and what have you.
No.
Who I would not describe as average.
You're totally right. It's about, like, developing relationships with people, and Tumblr is such a good place to try and do that, because people on there, they're really enthusiastic about the things they like. If you're on Tumblr, everyone you're interacting with is on there for real reasons. Like, if you're seeing them on Tumblr, they have some kind of community tie. They know people on there, and they are interacting with people, and they're, like, a part of it, And so there's, like, a greater willingness to engage with each other and talk to each other,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, a big part of it, that I'm doing this on Tumblr for sure. In terms of, like, other tips I have, I tend to try and pitch any given email to the least engaged person who follows it. I try to make sure that my emails are, like, really welcoming to people who don't know what the hell it is they've subscribed to. Like, I've got a lot of people who, like, I quoted that the number of subscribers, but, like, there's definitely a portion of them who are people who subscribed back in 2022 and haven't opened a single email, probably like 1,000 people. And so I try to keep that in mind when I write the emails, that, like, this might be someone who's checking their inbox and they don't know what the hell this is. They're opening, like, chapter 30. So I try to put, like, at the top, I've got, like, a little description of what it is they're subscribed to. And then I, like, before the text of the chapter, I tend to, like, put a little bit of something that, like, humanizes me and the project, and, like, it's news, or, like, it's a little difficult to think of things that are sort of universal when you have a theoretically global audience, is it, like, that anyone does online, but things about, like, if there's been a change in season, kind of just, like, little things. And I think that adds a lot. Sort of one of the things that I consider to be a bit of a mistake that I see people do is that they will just release, if you just put just the text of the fiction in the newsletter with nothing up top, it can be a little bit unfriendly. Unfriendly might not be the right word, but it can be a little intimidating. Intimidating is a good word.
A little impersonal.
Yeah, because, you've subscribed to this thing, and you've forgotten what it is, and you're opening the email, and you're like, what's this? And what you're met with is, like, sort of, John was talking to, like, you're immediately met with a whole bunch of, like, unfamiliar names. So it's like, I try to keep in mind those people with everything I do.
Are there any serial projects in the works that you can share with us?
I am working on a spiritual sequel, what I've been terming a spiritual sequel to What Manner of Man, which is, in the way that What Manner of Man is kind of a take on Dracula. It's quite different from Dracula, but it is, like, in conversation with Dracula. I'm doing another novel, which is in conversation with Frankenstein in the same way. I'm really excited about it. It's still early. It's early on. I'm still, like, working on it, but it's ended up being quite complicated and twisty little thing that I think is gonna be really, really good once I manage to get it all written.
And dare I predict queer as hell?
Oh yeah, no question. Absolutely.
Now, I'm guessing folks could stay up to the minute on those developments if they were subscribed to your newsletter. So where is the best place to do that?
My newsletter is, for better or for worse, currently hosted on Substack. So you can find me at sinjonstarling.substack.com. If you want to follow me on Tumblr, I'm also St. John Starling on Tumblr. And I do also use Blue Sky and technically Instagram. though to a far lesser extent.
And Instagram is there too.
Yeah.
Instagram gets the participation trophy of social media. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Sinjin, and I would be excited to have you back for another interview soon.
Thank you very much for having me.